earliest translations we have in English are interlinear translations. We had a lot of Latin manuscripts floating around England during the early days, and one of them is in the British Museum. It's an 8th century Latin Psalter with the 9th century English translation written between the lines. Some of these are very attractive, beautiful manuscripts. I'll show you an example or two here in just a minute. And then a very famous manuscript, the Lindisfarne Gospels, up in the northern coast of England, not very far from where Bede was a monk. The Lindisfarne Gospels were made. They are Latin manuscript written by Bishop Eadfrith of Lindisfarne near the close of the 7th century. That would be in the late 600s. In the middle of the 10th century, that is in the 900s, a priest named Aldred wrote literal English translation between the lines. These are some of the earliest parts of the Bible that were translated into Old English. You had the Psalms, and then you had the Gospels. These were interlinears. They were Latin, English, interlinear. What do we mean by an interlinear, Brother Maligarsa?
It's got the original language and then the other language like side by side on the same page, essentially.
Yeah, written between the lines. And I don't know if it's clear enough to see, but in between the larger Latin lines, there's little bits of English written in between the lines there, see? And
yeah, pick up that just for a couple seconds to the previous slide. Some of us didn't get it.
Go back to the previous slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
For a minute.
Yeah, these are some of the earliest English-Latin interlinears, like the one that we're looking at there of the Psalms on the next page and the Gospels. And I think I've got most of this in my little booklet there on how we got the Bible. All right. So mostly the Bibles that people had access to were Latin, but and they would read in Latin, and of course the people didn't understand Latin. The Mass was in Latin. People didn't understand Latin. And this was an attempt to make the Bible understandable not just to the people, but to even priests, because many priests weren't able to decipher Latin either. Lindisfarne Gospels are very famous. They're beautiful manuscripts. If you look in the Book of Kells, you can see some pictures of the frontispieces of the Lindisfarne Gospels. They're very beautiful, done at the monastery of Lindisfarne. This is the frontispiece of the Gospel of Matthew. Liber Generati, Book of the Generation of Jesus Christ, and you can see out in the margins there the little interlinear English translation written. And most of the pages would just be pages of text, but always the first page was very ornate, dressed up. These are called illuminated manuscripts. This is how the Lindisfarne Gospels actually look. What form of a book is this? What do we call this form of a book? It's a codex. And it's, yes.
Sorry, I guess you can't see me. I was wondering, the language that was spoken, I guess, that time they read in Latin, did that language become, or that reading, that translation become holy in that to those people just because it was translated in Latin? I don't know if I'm making myself clear or not, but you know how the people think that there is something holy about the language in which
Sure. Any people who are used to something being done in church in a certain way think that that's the holy way to do it. Latin sounded very holy to them, and it was very mysterious.
Today still read sometime in Latin, correct?
The Catholic Church in very conservative places does that, but the way you would relate that to our churches is that many people grew up hearing the Bible in the King James language and all the these and the thous and everything, and that became the language of prayer, and so they felt like King Jamesy language was holy language. And there are many people who still feel that way, even though intellectually they know better, but they feel that way because that was the language that they heard in the church all the time, see. So it's the same effect that we have with the King James these and thous and all the things that the 1600s had in their English, as they did back then with Latin.
Did that happen with any other translations? It happened with the Latin. Did it happen in anything that...
Oh, I'm sure it did in other places. You know, in other places it would have been whatever language they were hearing in church, like Greek or whatever.
Okay.
Here's another page out of the Lindisfarne Gospels. Remember the Lindisfarne Gospels, 7th century Latin manuscript. You can see here underneath, you can see the little English words written between the lines here better on this page. A 10th century translation into English. So you have a 7th century Latin manuscript. 10th century, a priest comes along and he writes the English translation in between the lines. Translation of the gospel. Here's a real close look at it. You can see I think this is part of the frontispiece of the Gospel of Luke. You can see some of the English words there scrawled between the lines. Much like Bede and some of those guys would have written. This is Luke 23:18 and following. I think in a translation that's of that speed, that day, in this type of English. This is about when they were talking about who to release, you know, in the trial of Jesus, whether to release Jesus or to release Barabbas. The first line, and to hear a Freilsdag. Well, the Freilsdag is a feast day, and they were going to release him at the feast day. And in the next line there, verse 18, Pahrim de el folk et gedra craze. And they all cried out at once, saying, you'd be hard-pressed to understand that. Nim pisna forgive us Baraban. Nim pisna forgive us Baraban. So you can kind of hear give us Barabbas, but it's very far removed, different than what we would have today. See, these are like some of the English translations that you'll find in the Lindisfarne Gospels from that time, from the 10th century. So you see, this is very, very, very different language in a different state of evolution than we speak today. This is the same passage, verse 19. Sapeus for Sumera Tripagnese, who had been thrown into prison. Men slight on sea per turn ascend, for a certain rebellion made in the city, and for murder. Well, you see, murder is manslaughter. See, what word do we have that's like manslaughter?
Manslayer.
Oh, yeah, or manslaughter, you know, that's murder, see? And so that's an old word that meant to kill a man. And then in verse 20, Est spake Pilatus to him bolda. Pilate, therefore, again called out to them. Them is H-I-M. And of course, Pilatus is Pilate. Spake, S-P-A-E-C, is spake or spoke. See? So you have some similarity there. For latent pain Haaland, wishing to release him from prison. So it's just, you know, so different that it would be impossible for us to understand any of this from this time. Now, the first independent English translation, independent meaning there was no interlinear, it was just strictly English all by itself. The first independent English translation of any part of the Bible was the Wessex Gospels. The Wessex Gospels. And I've forgotten briefly what the date of that was. Is it like the 11th century or something like that? What is your little how we got the Bible thing say there?
1066.
Yeah, it was kind of around the time of the Norman conquest, and it was when the Norman French influence had come in, and the language had evolved into a different stage, more like our language than it was before. This would probably be called Middle English instead of Old English. We'll take it line by line, and since you know the story of the parable of the sower, you can kind of follow it a little bit. Top line up there. Soth Lisa ut eld se sower his seed to sowen. See, out went the sower to sow his seed. Sa sower his seed to sowen. See, he's going to sow his seed. Second line. And tha he sow, and that which he sowed, summa he fell in the veg. Some fell by the way. See, veg, W-E-G, is way, W-A-G. Third line, second word, and fuglas komen and aten tha. See, fuglas are fowls, birds. Komen and aten tha. They came and ate it. Last word, third line. Soth Lisa, summa fehlen on steinheit. Some fell on stony ground. After the comma. There it neefte miklen earthen. It didn't have sufficient earth. And red Lisa upsprungen. It hurriedly sprung up. See? Next line. For them to he neeften their earthen deepen. It had not sufficiently deep earth. Next line. Soth Lisa upsprungen rasonnen. In other words, up came the sun. The sun came out. Is agrungen and forskrunken for them to he neeften wirthermen. It dried it up, withered it. See? After the period, Soth Lisa summa fehlen on thornas. You see the word thorns? Some fell on thorns. Summa fehlen on thornas. And the thornas waxen. Have you ever heard in the King James Bible the word waxed? It waxed this or waxed that. See, here you have that old word. And the thornas waxen. That means they really got busy and grew a whole bunch of thorns. They waxed. They waxen. And for Thrisman, they choked it out. And Summa Soth Lisa fehlen in good earthen. It fell on good earth. See? And sealed them wastem. It bore fruit. Sum hunde gefielde, sum sixte gefielde, and sum 30 gefielde. Some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Now see, if you didn't know this was the parable of the sower, and you didn't have someone taking you through it line by line, you'd still really be hard-pressed to make heads or tails out of this. But this is the parable of the sower, and it's a translation into Middle English. Still a far cry in its evolution from where we are today, right? You put this in the hand of somebody on the street today and say, okay, read the Bible for yourself and figure it out. Well, they would be completely lost. And again, remember, what is the purpose of translation? The purpose of translation is to share the gospel with people in a different language. If the translation is such an antiquated language that nobody can understand it, then it doesn't serve any useful purpose at all. It doesn't convey the message of the gospel in the receptor language to the hearer. The Normans were, in World War II, they stormed the beaches at Normandy in France. The Normans were sort of the French invaders. And the Saxons were the German invaders. And the Norman conquest, as we said, changed the face of the English language and people, so that the form of English that they spoke after the Norman conquest and the form of English they spoke before the Norman conquest were very, very different. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought great changes to English culture. Norman French mixed with spoken English, so that before long the English of the Wessex Gospels was unintelligible to the masses of English people. So after the Wessex Gospels, the Norman French changed the language a great deal, and it became more and more like the language that we speak today, and less like the language that they spoke before. Now Chaucer, his writings come from around this time, and this gives you an idea of some of the form of the language after the Norman Conquest, a little bit more like what the language would be in our time. Let me read you a few lines of this story by Chaucer. It says, "And when I saw he would never find to read on this cursed book at night." In other words, when I saw that he was never going to read this cursed book at night. Third line. Suddenly, see, 3 leaves have I flight out of his book right as he read. In other words, I tore 3 pages out of his book right as he read. End of the 4th line. "And eke I with my fist so took him on the cheek," he popped the other guy in the face with his fist. Next line, "that in our fur he fist backward adown." He fell down when I smacked him in the head, is what it means. Next line, "and up he start as doth a wood lion." He got up as a wooden lion, "and with his fist he smote me in the head." I bet he did. "That in the floor I lay as I were dead." See? "And when he saw how still that I lay," see? When he saw how still I lay, "he was aghast and would have fled his way." He wanted to run away, see? "Till at last out of my swoon I prayed." In other words, I woke up out of my faint. Oh, hast thou slain me, false thief?" I said, "and for my land thus hast thou murdered me." Mordred me. See, mordred me is murdered me. "Ere I be dead, yet will I kiss thee." Now, what we learn from this is if you took him with your fist on the cheek, he will smote thee in the head, and thou wilt lie down as dead. Okay? But if you went to northern Scotland, this wouldn't sound so far-fetched, because they speak a less evolved form of the language back there. So this would be very hard still for us to understand. And even in this little excerpt from Chaucer, there has been some concession to the way we make our letters so that you can read even what's being said. So this would be more the form of the language that, we can understand it better, but it would still be very difficult for us to understand the Bible if it were written in that language. Now, in 1096, I believe it was, somewhere around there, the Pope preached the first crusade, and people from not only England, but France and Germany and Italy and all over the Roman Empire went to the Holy Land to defend Jerusalem and to try to take the Holy Land away from the Turks, from the Muslims. And there were many battles fought, and much treasure was plundered, and much stuff was brought back, as we said before, into the western part of the Roman Empire, and a great deal was learned during the time of the Crusades. It was the Muslim culture that preserved a lot of the ancient learning during the Dark Ages. Of course, Muhammad was born in that period of time, and he became very influential not only in the Arabian Peninsula during his life, But after his life, the caliphs attacked all across North Africa, and all across Spain, and all across Turkey, and they conquered much of the land in the Holy Land, and they preached the religion of Islam, submission or surrender to Allah, the one God who has no son. And so in the intervening years after that, the age of the caliphs, the Holy Land and the Middle East and North Africa and what is called the Iberian Peninsula up there in Spain, that all became Muslim territory, see? And the Crusades were wars by the Christian empire against the Islamic empire, particularly with the objective of taking the city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land away from the Islamic peoples. And there were many bloody wars fought over it. The Orlando Bloom movie, Kingdom of Heaven, The Kingdom of Heaven, is about the Crusades. I give you some idea about what was going on there. The Arabian Peninsula was conquered by Islam in Muhammad's lifetime. Antioch of Syria fell in 635, Jerusalem in 637, Alexandria, Egypt in 640, Carthage, North Africa, 698, Cordoba, Spain, 711. Constantinople was taken. So really the Eastern Empire as a whole fell into the hands of the Islamic people till the time of the Crusades. They preserved mathematics. They preserved the classics of the ancient Greek writers. They preserved and explored medicine, astronomy. The Islamic culture was far more advanced, far more educated than the Western European culture that had been in the Dark Ages. And so when the Crusades went into the Eastern Empire and brought back the culture and language and learning of the East, there was a great deal of change in the culture and language and learning of the Western Empire as well, as a result of these Crusades. Now, the reason we're saying all of that is because the result of this had a very profound effect on the history of the European continent. The rise of the universities were groups of people that met in different places to study all of these books, all of this learning that had been brought back from the Eastern Empire. And as they studied and pored over these things and learned, they learned again how to read Greek and Hebrew, and they learned the classics again, and they learned the many things from the church fathers again, and they learned all kinds of stuff from the Islamic culture again, and it began to raise questions in these people. Many universities in the 10s, 11s, 1200s rose up all over Europe, and learning was just exploding everywhere after the Crusades. It was like the Enlightenment period. And this was also true in the British Isles. We're talking about the English Bible. In places like Oxford and Cambridge and York and St. Andrews in Scotland, there were universities that sprung up, and people started asking questions. You know, when people start learning, they start asking questions. For example, if you're learning to read Greek, and you're reading a Greek manuscript of 1 John chapter 5, you're going to notice as you read 1 John chapter 5 in Greek, wait a minute here now, hold the phone here now. This doesn't say there are three that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, that these three agree in one. That's not even in this Greek manuscript. What's the deal here? See? And so the forbidden question is asked. What's going on here? This Bible says this over here, but my Greek manuscript that's way older, it says this over here. What's the deal? And the Catholic Church says, you're not supposed to ask that question. That's a bad question. See? And other things of the same nature were being found out and asked. For example, Matthew 23:9, people were learning to read, and it said, "Call no man your father upon the earth." And they're thinking, wait a minute now. If that's true, well then what are we doing calling this priest father and so forth? So more questions began to be asked. And more people were studying in Germany and in France and in Italy and in the universities in Britain. And if you start teaching the people, they start asking questions. See, if people actually start reading the Bible, even if it's in Greek or Latin, they say, now, wait a minute. The Bible says this right here, but we're doing this over here. How come? And so the air began to have controversy in it. There began to be disputes about things. And by the 1300s, this hadn't become full-blown yet, but there were some rumblings. In Cambridge, there was a man by the name of, or was it Oxford or Cambridge? I forgot. Was it Oxford? John Wycliffe was Oxford, Cambridge.
Oxford.
Oxford, yeah. Oxford. He lived 1329 through 1384. And Wycliffe was a Catholic priest. He lived and died a Catholic priest. And he was a teacher, very well educated in the languages and so forth. He questioned many of the practices of the Roman Church simply because he was reading the Bible. And he was reading things that didn't seem to go along with the teachings of the Roman Church. He actually encouraged the preaching of the Bible to the people. Now see, the position of the church up to that time had been that the Bible belonged to the church. The church would tell the people what to think, but the people didn't need to be troubled with the Bible. The priest would do the Mass, meaning the Lord's Supper. He would do it in Latin. You know, he would say the words in Latin, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body. And the people thought he was putting a magic whammy on the bread when he said hocus corpus meum, hocus pocus, you know. But he was just saying, this is my body. And it was all very mysterious. But Wycliffe actually encouraged the priests in his area to teach the Bible to the people. And of course, if you teach the Bible to the people, then who's going to start asking questions also? Not just the priests, but the people. See, will start asking questions. So he did a very dangerous thing. His students were called lollards. I don't know why they used that term. These were these young priests that went out preaching in the country churches all around. And they were actually preaching the gospel stories, and they were preaching the stories of the Bible and preaching what the Bible said. So they were getting in trouble by the church hierarchy and were being persecuted. And it was in his later years that he and his followers began to translate the Bible into English in manuscript form. Now, they wanted to kill John Wycliffe, but he died of natural causes in 1384 and beat them to it, see. So instead of being killed by his persecutors, he ended up just dying. But nearly 100 years later, they dug up his bones when they were persecuting William Tyndale and others. And they burned him to ashes, and they scattered his ashes in the river Swift in order to encourage nobody else to do this kind of devil's work of translating the Holy Scriptures into the vulgar tongue of English. The English is a mongrel language. How dare you take Holy Scripture, meant to be read in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and translate holy words into a mongrel language like English? See, how sacrilegious can you possibly get? Yes, Brother Dustin Campbell.
I know, and I've heard, and I don't know how accurate it is, but I know the Roman Catholic Church would chain the Bible to the pulpit up front so regular members couldn't read it.
Yeah, we haven't got that far yet.
Okay, so that's later on. That's what I was.
See, we're like 150 years before that.
Okay.
But we're going to get there. All right. So John Wycliffe. Now see, just think of what we're here in 1380s. Now, King James was translated 1611, so this is still nearly 300 years before. Back there in the middle, is it Jack that's got his hand up?
Yes, I have a question as to when he was born, because your book says 1320, but the slide says 29.
I'd probably go with the slide. And you can do your own research and see what you find out. Yes, Brother Tony?
We know how accurate Wycliffe's translation was.
Well, it was pretty good translation as far as I can tell. The little that I've read of it, based on a lot of it, I guess, was based on the Latin text. But it's pretty good translation as far as it goes. See, when you say translation, let's clarify what we mean. See, this is where we get into failure to communicate. When you ask me, is it a good translation, what exactly do you mean? See, if you mean, was the original language it was taken from accurately represented in the receptor language, then probably the answer to that is yes. See, you could ask me, is the King James an accurate translation? And I would have to say yes. It is an accurate translation of the Textus Receptus. See, but there's more to it than that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because it's not just a question of the accuracy of translation. It's a question of the accuracy of the Greek text that lies underneath the translation. See what I'm saying?
Do we know what text he was using?
I believe that Wycliffe was using the Latin text of the New Testament, at least. I'm not sure if he was using the Hebrew in the Old Testament or not, but I believe Latin. I'm going to have to do a little more research, but I think it was Latin. All right? Anyway, the point was this was revolutionary because, you know, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, for example, Tony, and the Psalters and all those were Latin-English interlinears. It was typical back then for them to take the Latin manuscript, translate them into English. But in the case of Wycliffe, he was making a radical move by translating the entire Bible into the language of the people with the view toward letting the people be able to see what the Bible actually said, which was a brand new radical concept in Catholicism, see, because Catholicism did not want the people knowing what the Bible said. They wanted the church to tell the people what the Bible said. In Catholicism, the authority is the church, not the Bible. If you start letting the people read the Bible, they're going to say, wait a minute, the Bible says A, but the church says B, which is going to create a problem that they did not want. This is a picture that pictures Wycliffe and the students, you know, and the students going out and preaching the Bible in the countryside. This is a photograph of the manuscript Bible, the Wycliffe Bible. And I don't know how well you can see it here. I got to look a little closer. But where it starts there in the left-hand column with the ornamental T there, take heed that ye do, next line, not your righteousness before men to be seen of him. Else ye should have no meed at your Father. In other words, no reward from your Father, yet is in heavens. For when you doest alms, next line, and I'm not having trouble even with that part, but it's very much different than our language. And one of the differences is it is a manuscript Bible. See, this English translation is entirely written by hand. Just like the Greek and Latin manuscripts, it is a manuscript Bible. I think I've got a bigger picture of it here. Yeah, on the next page. You can make some of it out if you look at it there, but you see that the letters are made very different. Starting with the first one up there, Say-heed, H-E-D-E. Yat, Y-A-T. Ye do, second line, not your, Y-O-U-R-E. Righteousness before men to be S-E-Y-N. Sayin of him. H-E-M. See, H-E-M is like T-H-E-M. So it's very different, isn't it? 1380s. 300 years before the time of the King James. It's English, but it's not our English. You know, if it was good for John Wycliffe, if it was good for John Wycliffe, it was good for John Wycliffe, is it good enough for me? Well, if we lived in that time and understood that language, this is another column out of John Wycliffe. If you look at the second line after the slash, it says our, last two words in the second line, our Father, third line, yet art ye heathens, hallowed be, next line, ye name. After the slash, ye kingdom come, to be, ye will done. In era as ni heaven. After the slash, give to us this day our bread, and forgive our debts. Forgive to us our debts, as we forgiven to our debtors. You know, very different. It's the Lord's Prayer, but it's still very different. It's written very different. The letters are different. Everything's different. Many of the spellings are different. But it's obvious that the language is evolving. It's changing. Let me give you a modern day example of this real quick. Let's talk about the word cool. C-O-O-L. Cool. Okay, now I doubt that the word cool, just like that, even existed in the time of Wycliffe. But at some point in the evolution of our language, cool, C-O-O-L, came to mean low in temperature. See, as opposed to hot, it was cool, lower in temperature, cool. But then, as the English language developed, other meanings were taken on for that word. Cool it means stop it. Cool it. Stop it. Or you could say she was very cool to me. That means that she was not very welcoming. She was not very warm. She was not very nice to me. She was very cool, standoffish to me. And then somebody would say, that is so cool. And that would mean something completely different. Like, that is really interesting. It's neat. It's fun. It's cool. Or if somebody came in, you know, dressed like, I don't know who I would pick out in that room, but like me, they would say, wow, he is cool, you know, meaning really with it, you know. And so you have all of these different meanings of the one word cool. Many of those meanings didn't exist back when, and will quickly go out of vogue and will not be used in that way later, which is another example of how words change and evolve and take on different meanings. The language is always changing. What guarantees that the language is changing? Well, because culture is changing. Events are changing. People's education is changing. What is a gigabyte? What is Googling somebody? What is, you know, these words didn't even exist a few years ago. And there's a continual change in language. So any language that is continuing to be spoken, that language will always change. So there will always need to be new translations. It is the original language, Greek and Hebrew, that will stay the same. But translations must change with the times. Why? So that the gospel may be communicated to the people of that time. See what I'm saying? If you really think about this, it's inherent in the Great Commission. People that have problems with new translations, just the idea of new translations, don't understand this stuff. It's a fact of our existence that we have to have new translations. I would foresee that 50 years from now, when I'm long dead and some of y'all are old men, there will have to be new translations even then to communicate, because the language will have changed so much between now and then. Because everything in our world is changing, but the original language will not change. See? So that should give us great comfort. John Wycliffe, Manuscript Bible, late 1300s. This is the first part of John's Gospel in John Wycliffe's Bible. See there with the big I? In ye beginning was, second line, ye word. And ye word, third line, was at God. Uh-oh. Notice what Wycliffe did not do with the word God. Capitalized it. And God was ye word. Yes was in ye beginning at God. All yegus, all things, all yegus weren mad be him. They were mad be him. Why were they mad be him? No, they were made by him. But see, mad, M-A-A-D, is made, M-A-D-E. All yegus were mad be him. So this is John 1, and it says what it says, but it's in a different kind of language than we speak. Okay. Now, let this gel in your consciousnesses, and we'll come back and talk another time.